It began, as many of Bernays' most infamous campaigns did, with a problem dressed up as progress. In the late 1920s, cigarette companies faced a peculiar obstacle. Nearly half the population and women were not smoking. Social taboos, Victorian notions of propriety, and public stigma kept cigarettes firmly in the domain of men. Bernays' client, American Tobacco Company, wanted that to change. And they didn't want a marketing campaign. They wanted a cultural revolution. Bernays studied the psychology of the time. Women were marching for the vote, entering the workforce, challenging the patriarchy. Feminism, still in its early public stages, was emerging as a powerful social force. What if smoking could be linked to liberation? Bernays staged an elaborate stunt on March 31, 1929, during the annual Easter Parade in New York City. A group of debutantes, handpicked and coached by Bernays' team, walked down Fifth Avenue, cigarettes in hand, lighting them in unison before a sea of photographers. He had tipped off the press beforehand, telling them a group of women's rights activists were planning a protest against gender inequality. The next day, newspapers across America carried dramatic headlines: "Women light torches of freedom and equality protest." The phrase, "torches of freedom," was Bernays' invention. But it didn't matter. The association was made. Smoking wasn't a vice anymore. It was a statement. Within a year, millions of women who had never touched a cigarette were lighting up. The manipulation was invisible. And that was exactly how Bernays liked it. "We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested," Bernays wrote. "We are dominated by men we have never heard of." If influencing adults was one thing, programming children was another. And Bernays had no qualms about either. In the early 1920s, Procter & Gamble approached him with a problem. Ivory soap was a household product, but competition was fierce. Advertising wasn't enough. They needed brand loyalty that would last a lifetime. Bernays proposed something revolutionary. Instead of selling soap, sell identity. He created the Ivory Soap Sculpture Contest, a national event in which school children were encouraged to carve sculptures out of bars of soap. Newspapers celebrated the creativity. Teachers incorporated the contest into their curriculum. Children competed eagerly, proud to show off their creations. But beneath the surface, a darker psychology was at play. By embedding the product into the earliest stages of childhood experience, Bernays was hardwiring loyalty before the rational mind ever formed. Generations of Americans grew up associating Ivory soap not just with cleanliness, but with memory, pride, and creativity. It was no longer a brand. It was a piece of their childhood. Bernays had discovered how to program behavior long before the age of consent, and he would never unlearn the lesson. The reach of Bernays' influence was not confined to consumer products. In time, it would help overthrow governments. In the early 1950s, Bernays was hired by United Fruit Company, now Chiquita Brands International, a powerful U.S. corporation with vast banana plantations in Central America. Their biggest threat came not from competitors, but from democracy itself. In Guatemala, a newly elected president named Jacobo Arbenz was introducing land reforms that threatened United Fruit's stranglehold on the country's economy. The company turned to Bernays. His plan was chilling in its simplicity. He reframed the Guatemalan government's actions not as land reform, but as a communist threat in America's backyard. He planted stories in newspapers. He arranged press junkets where American journalists were flown into Guatemala and briefed by local elites on the alleged Soviet infiltration. He orchestrated protests and whispered rumors in diplomatic circles, and by the time the CIA launched Operation PB Success in 1954, a coup that ousted Arbenz and installed a pro-U.S. military regime, public opinion in America overwhelmingly supported it. The headlines read, "Communist infiltration in Central America stopped." But it wasn't true. Guatemala was no Soviet pawn. It was simply a democracy that had challenged corporate power and lost. This was not propaganda anymore. This was psychological warfare, and it had been waged not by soldiers, but by a single man who knew how to make the public beg for outcomes they did not understand. By the 1950s, Bernays' fingerprints were everywhere, in products, politics, public health, and foreign policy. When the U.S. government sought to add fluoride to drinking water to prevent tooth decay, a move some citizens resisted, Bernays was hired to shape public opinion. He reframed fluoridation as a scientific consensus and mobilized dentists as trusted messengers. Dissenters were painted as paranoid conspiracy theorists. Public resistance crumbled. He even advised political campaigns, applying the same methods he had used for bacon, cigarettes, and coups to democracy itself. Voters were no longer citizens weighing policies. They were consumers choosing a brand. In each case, Bernays deployed the same chilling logic: bypass reason, target emotion, manipulate identity. And the more he succeeded, the less anyone noticed. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, Bernays once wrote, "It is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will, without their knowing it, influence." And by then, the damage was irreversible. The real shock did not come from any one campaign, not the cigarettes or the coups or the soap carvings. It came from a chilling realization uncovered by journalists, academics, and intelligence analysts in the 1950s and 60s. Bernays' ideas had become the foundation of government psychological operations. Declassified documents later revealed that agencies like the CIA and OSS had studied Bernays' writings extensively during World War II and the Cold War. His techniques of emotional manipulation, crowd psychology, and narrative control became standard operating procedure in psychological warfare programs. Even more disturbing, Bernays himself had advised U.S. intelligence officials on how to manage the image of America abroad and how to shape domestic opinion on foreign conflicts. The techniques he pioneered to sell bacon and cigarettes were now being used to sell wars. It wasn't just the state that learned from him. Corporations, now armed with massive budgets and emerging technologies like television, industrialized Bernays' methods on a scale he could scarcely have imagined. Public relations firms mushroomed across the country, staffed by disciples of his teachings. Every election slogan, every consumer ad, every news story framed for maximum emotional impact bore his fingerprints. Investigators soon realized the terrifying truth. Bernays had not just manipulated the public. He had reprogrammed democracy itself. The line between truth and fiction, fact and persuasion had blurred. Public opinion was no longer organic. It was manufactured. And it wasn't just America. Bernays consulted for governments around the world. His methods spread to Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Entire regimes learned how to create consent without ever lifting a gun. One U.S. senator described Bernays' legacy with chilling accuracy during a 1958 hearing on propaganda and psychological warfare. When the scale of Edward Bernays' influence finally began to dawn on the American public, the reaction was not outrage, it was confusion. How could one man, working quietly from behind the scenes, have rewritten the rules of persuasion? How could ideas born from a psychoanalyst's study of the human subconscious come to shape the behavior of an entire nation? The truth was that Bernays' power did not fade with time. It mutated. The first cracks in the facade appeared in the early 1950s, when journalists, politicians, and scholars began to examine the rise of what some called the public relations state. Newspapers published exposés about corporate influence campaigns. Academics dissected Bernays' writings in universities. Even President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his famous 1961 farewell address, warned of the growing power of invisible forces shaping public opinion. But Bernays himself remained unapologetic. In a 1955 interview with the New York Times, he stated calmly, "The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process. The people must be free to choose, but they must be guided in how to choose." To his critics, this was Orwellian doublespeak. To Bernays, it was logic. Democracy, he argued, could not survive chaos. The masses, left to their own devices, would be irrational and self-destructive. Only by steering them, subtly, invisibly, could order prevail. The most significant challenge came in 1957, when a series of Senate hearings on propaganda and psychological warfare sought to determine whether such methods had subverted democracy itself. Witnesses testified about staged events, planted news stories, and front groups that disguised corporate or political agendas as grassroots movements. But the hearings led nowhere. No laws were passed. No agencies were dismantled. Bernays was never charged with a crime. New York City, October 30th, 1929. The air on Wall Street smells of sweat and ink. Panic clings to the pavement. Bankers with hollow eyes clutch briefcases as if they were life rafts. Fortune after fortune vanishes in a matter of hours. Millions lose everything. Families stand outside shuttered banks, praying for a miracle that will never come. But behind this chaos, behind the smoke, the broken glass, and the headlines, there was a man. A man whose name you've almost certainly never heard. He never held public office. He never ran a corporation. He never fired a shot. Yet quietly and visibly, he rewired the American mind. He turned crowds into puppets, democracy into a stage, and freedom into an illusion. And when the dust settled, he had changed the very way America thinks. His name was Edward Bernays. And what authorities, and even his closest allies, would later discover about his methods was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Channel introduction, 30 seconds. Before we uncover the chilling truth about Edward Bernays, the man who shaped your thoughts before you ever knew his name, make sure you subscribe to The Lost Fear and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story hidden beneath the surface of history. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers as we dive deep into the forgotten chapters of our shared past. The year is 1917, and the United States stands on the brink of transformation. Factories belch smoke into the sky as cities swell with new arrivals from Europe. Automobiles rattle across cobblestone streets, and telephones ring in homes that just a decade ago had no electricity. The world is changing, fast, but change brings instability. Across the Atlantic, Europe is mired in the bloodiest conflict humanity has ever seen, the First World War. And America, still uncertain of its place on the global stage, is deeply divided. Isolationists warn against foreign entanglements. Immigrants fear persecution. Pacifists organize marches. Newspapers scream opposing headlines. The nation is fragmented, perhaps fatally so. It is in this atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty that a young man named Edward Louis Bernays quietly begins his work. Born in Vienna in 1891, Bernays was the double nephew of none other than Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. And it was from Freud that Bernays learned a chilling lesson, that beneath every rational decision lies a swamp of primal emotion, fear, desire, envy, lust, and shame. Bernays would not become a physician like his uncle. Instead, he chose a different battlefield, one not of bodies, but of minds, and the war he would wage would change the world forever. By 1917, President Woodrow Wilson knew America could not remain neutral in Europe's great conflict much longer. But public opinion was staunchly against entering the war. Anti-war rallies filled the streets. Congress wavered. Newspapers called it Europe's fight. The administration faced an impossible task. How do you convince a divided, isolationist public to support sending their sons into the slaughterhouse of trench warfare? The answer would come in the form of a new entity, the Committee on Public Information, CPI, also known as the Creel Committee, a government propaganda machine designed to turn skeptics into soldiers. Bernays was recruited into this fledgling experiment. His mission, shape public opinion, but he wasn't interested in mere persuasion. He wanted to engineer consent. He studied Freud's writings and realized something extraordinary. Humans are not guided by facts or reason. They are guided by symbols, fears, and subconscious drives. So instead of appealing to logic, Bernays targeted the limbic brain. The CPI's campaigns became psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Posters depicted German soldiers as monstrous Huns, bayoneting children and burning churches. News articles, written by CPI operatives, planted stories of German atrocities in local papers. Public rallies turned dissenters into outcasts, questioning their loyalty, and it worked. Within a year, millions of Americans were waving flags, buying war bonds, and sending their sons to the trenches, believing it was their patriotic duty. Bernays had discovered a terrifying truth. With the right symbols, you can make people believe anything. When the war ended in 1918, Bernays faced a new question. If propaganda could move nations to war, could it also be used in peace? The answer came quickly, and in the form of dollar signs. Corporations, shaken by post-war recession and rising labor unrest, saw in Bernays something extraordinary. He could do for them what he had done for Wilson, manipulate the masses. Only now, instead of sending them to war, he would send them to the stores. One of his first major campaigns came from a company struggling to sell a product most Americans didn't want: bacon. In the 1920s, breakfast in America was light: coffee, toast, maybe fruit. But Bernays was hired by Beechnut Packing Company to increase bacon sales. Instead of advertising directly, he asked doctors to sign a statement declaring that a hearty breakfast was healthier than a light one. Newspapers printed the story nationwide. Soon, millions of Americans were eating bacon and eggs every morning, not because they wanted to, but because they believed it was healthy. This was not marketing. It was manipulation, and it worked. Bernays' campaigns multiplied. For Lucky Strike, he convinced women that smoking was a symbol of liberation. Torches of freedom, he called them. For United Fruit Company, he helped overthrow governments in Latin America, framing coups as defenses of democracy. For Procter & Gamble, he linked soap to childhood competitions, creating the concept of fun hygiene. By the mid-1920s, Bernays had become one of the most influential men in America, though his name rarely appeared in headlines. Presidents sought his counsel. Corporations paid fortunes for his insights, and journalists reprinted his ideas without question. In 1928, he published a book that would make his philosophy explicit. Its title was simple: Propaganda. In it, Bernays wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power." This was not hyperbole. It was a declaration. Bernays believed democracy could not function if people made their own choices. They had to be guided, shaped, nudged, and controlled by those who understood their desires better than they did. And so, under the guise of democracy, a new kind of power emerged, one that did not rule by law or force, but by influence. What made Bernays truly dangerous was not his intelligence, but his invisibility. He did not stand at podiums or sign legislation. He never commanded armies or passed decrees. Instead, he pulled strings from behind the curtain. He once advised a cigarette company on how to increase female smokers, not by lowering prices or running ads, but by staging a dramatic spectacle. During the 1929 Easter Parade in New York, a group of debutantes lit cigarettes and marched down Fifth Avenue, calling them torches of freedom. Newspapers across the country reported it as a spontaneous feminist protest. It wasn't. Bernays had staged the entire event. The public believed it was witnessing a moment of social progress. In reality, it was watching a marketing campaign, and it would not be the last time. By the late 1920s, the United States was no longer a nation of citizens. It was a nation of consumers, taught to crave, to buy, to obey their impulses rather than their intellect. Democracy had become theater, and Bernays was its director. The timing could not have been worse. As Wall Street's bubble inflated and speculation spiraled out of control, Bernays' techniques, designed to bypass rational thought, had created a society addicted to desire. Americans bought on credit, gambled on stocks, and believed endless growth was their birthright. When the market collapsed in October 1929, millions were left destitute. But even then, Bernays' influence lingered. Newspapers blamed speculators, immigrants, bankers, anyone but the system itself. Few ever realized how deeply their decisions had been shaped long before the first stock certificate was purchased. And through it all, Bernays remained untouched, quietly advising new clients, shaping new narratives, manipulating new generations. What the public didn't yet know was that Bernays' most controversial campaigns and his darkest legacy were still to come, and what authorities would uncover in the decades ahead would shake the very foundations of American democracy. America was rebuilding, or so it believed. The crash of 1929 had shattered millions of lives, but out of the rubble came something even more insidious. A nation desperate for certainty, hungry for meaning, vulnerable. And Edward Bernays, now more powerful than ever, was about to exploit that vulnerability in ways that would reshape the very soul of a democracy.